May 23, 1943. Argentia Naval Station, Newfoundland. Fog clung to the harbor like smoke from a dying fire. The sea was quiet now, the convoy at anchor, gray ships lined in precise, endless rows. Beneath the mist, the dull clank of chains and the creak of wet wood echoed across the docks. The prisoners were coming ashore. Oberleutnant Heinrich Bruns stepped down the gangway of the destroyer USS Bory, his boots slipping on the damp planks. Behind him, a column of men in tattered Kriegsmarine uniforms shuffled forward, their faces pale from the long voyage. The Americans had taken their belts, their caps, even their watches. All that remained were the stains of oil and salt on their tunics, the last marks of a fight that had ended below the Atlantic. Bruns had been the executive officer of U-175. He could still hear the depth charges, the relentless thunder, the groaning hull, the rush of seawater when the pressure seals failed. His captain had gone down with the boat. Bruns and 40 others had been dragged from the wreckage by sailors young enough to be his cadets. Now, as he reached the pier, he turned his head and froze. Spread before him was a sight that defied everything he thought he knew about war. Rows of cranes moved in perfect rhythm, unloading freighters that stretched to the horizon. Giant derricks swung crates marked Boston, Seattle, Detroit, Buffalo. Names that seemed to belong to another planet. Trucks rolled down ramps, engines humming, tires slick with seawater. Steam hissed from rail lines that ran straight to the docks, each track bearing flat cars loaded with tanks, barrels of oil, and endless stacks of wooden crates stamped U.S. Army ordnance. The fog thickened for a moment, and when it cleared, Bruns saw something else. Something that made his stomach tighten. Liberty ships, hundreds of them, each one identical, each one new, their hulls clean, their flags bright. He'd heard the word before. Liberty. The Americans boasted of their Liberty Fleet, claiming to build ships faster than the U-boats could sink them. He'd dismissed it as propaganda, a sailor's tale meant to mock the Reich's blockade of the Atlantic. But now, standing here on this foreign dock, he realized it was true. The scale was beyond comprehension. Everywhere he looked, the Americans were building, moving, repairing. There was no sign of fatigue, no rubble, no fear. Only momentum. A kind of mechanical hunger that consumed steel and coal and gave back power. Behind him, one of the younger POWs whispered, "Mein Gott, sie sind wie Maschinen." My God, they are like machines. Bruns said nothing. He only watched as a column of American sailors marched past, rifles slung casually over their shoulders, laughter cutting through the morning fog. Their uniforms were clean, their faces were full. They looked nothing like men at war. He had spent years under the Reich's banners, listening to speeches about German efficiency, about discipline and superiority. But this was something else. It was not pride that filled the air here. It was confidence. "Move along," an American sergeant barked. "Trucks waiting." The prisoners climbed into open-bed lorries, escorted by Marines with Thompsons. As they pulled away, the convoy passed through the naval yard. Everywhere, machinery groaned and sparks flew. The smell of diesel and welding smoke clung to the air. Bruns turned to look back. In the distance, the cranes were still moving, relentless, tireless, lifting the bones of another Liberty ship into the sky. He whispered under his breath, "If this is one harbor, what do the others look like?" The Marine beside him, not understanding the words, but catching the tone, gave a tight smile. "You ain't seen nothing yet, Kraut." The truck rumbled forward through the mist, carrying the prisoners inland toward the unknown. They had survived the Atlantic. But what they were about to witness would change them more than any battle ever could. 2 days later, the trucks had crossed the forests of Maine and rolled south through endless highways lined with billboards and telephone wires. The prisoners rode in silence, guarded by young Marines who passed cigarettes between them, laughing over jokes no one else understood. By dawn, the column approached the outskirts of Boston Harbor. The fog lifted just as they reached the waterfront, and the Germans saw the full measure of what the United States had become. Bruns leaned forward, his fingers gripping the truck's metal sideboard. What lay before him was not a port. It was an empire of motion. The harbor spread in every direction. A vast mechanical city of cranes, gantries, and ships. Dozens of Liberty vessels were tied to the docks, each one being loaded with cargo. Tanks, trucks, crated aircraft engines, sacks of wheat, barrels of oil. Railroad tracks spidered through the yard, converging on freight terminals the size of cathedrals. Steam locomotives hissed and shrieked, hauling strings of boxcars that stretched beyond sight. He had never seen so many trains in his life. Not even Berlin, not even Hamburg, had looked like this. The Americans didn't seem to understand exhaustion. Men in overalls moved in seamless rhythm, operating cranes, loading pallets, tightening cables. Forklifts darted between them like insects. The entire scene pulsed with energy, mechanical, relentless, alive. A ship's horn bellowed in the distance. Another Liberty ship slid away from the pier, her gray hull cutting through the harbor like a knife. Painted across her bow were the words, SS Jeremiah O'Brien. Steam poured from her funnels as tugs guided her out into the bay. On deck, crewmen waved to the workers below. Another vessel, another load of supplies bound for the war. Bruns turned to one of the guards, a corporal with grease on his sleeves. "How many ships?" he asked haltingly in English. The American looked at him, surprised he spoke. "How many?" "Hell, buddy, I lost count. They say one comes out every 4 days. Sometimes 3. Bruns blinked. 4 days? To build a ship?" The corporal laughed. "That's right. Liberty ships. We crank 'em out like sausages." The prisoner turned back toward the harbor. 4 days. It had taken the Kriegsmarine months, even years, to build a Type I U-boat. And these Americans were building entire fleets faster than Germany could sink them. He thought back to the Atlantic. The endless gray water, the narrow conning tower, the diesel fumes that clung to his clothes. He remembered the pride he'd felt when the Reich had declared that U-boats would starve Britain into surrender. But standing here now, watching cranes swing their cargo across an ocean of steel, he understood the futility of it. The Americans weren't starving. They were feeding on their own creation. Behind him, another POW muttered, "Wenn sie das alles haben, wir sollen wir je gewinnen." If they have all this, how could we ever win? No one answered. The convoy of trucks continued past warehouses stacked 5 stories high, each one filled with crates marked Lend-Lease and U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps. In one open yard, hundreds of jeeps sat in neat rows, gleaming under the midday sun. Beyond them, aircraft wings were being loaded onto rail cars, destined for assembly plants farther inland. Bruns had read about America's arsenal of democracy. He dismissed it as Roosevelt's rhetoric, another boast from a nation that didn't understand war. But now, he saw it for what it was. An ocean of steel and oil and organization so vast it seemed to rewrite the laws of war itself. And yet, what disturbed him most wasn't the machines. It was the mood. The workers sang as they labored. The guards laughed. The engineers smoked and chatted over blueprints as if they were building playgrounds, not weapons. The air buzzed with optimism, a confidence that bordered on innocence. In Germany, war had long since become desperation. Bombed factories, rations, fear. But here, it was industry, efficiency, purpose. As the convoy left the harbor and wound its way toward a fenced POW camp outside the city, Bruns looked back one last time. The cranes were still moving. Another ship was sliding down the ways, her hull gleaming as she hit the water. The noise was deafening. Steel on steel, engines roaring, whistles blowing. And yet beneath it all, he heard something else. A rhythm. The heartbeat of a nation that had found its stride. He whispered in German, almost to himself. Wir haben den Krieg nie verstanden. We never understood this war. The Marine beside him, hearing the tone, if not the words, leaned closer and said with a grin, "Get used to it, pal. You're in America now." The truck rattled on, carrying the prisoners through a land that seemed to never sleep. A country that had turned war into production, and production into destiny. The Germans had been soldiers, but America, Bruns realized, was something different. America was an engine. Weeks passed. The prisoners were moved inland, deeper into the heart of America. First by train, then by truck. The journey took them through farmlands, towns, and cities that seemed to stretch forever. There was no destruction here, no ruins, no burned-out houses. The war they had fled felt a world away. At first, Bruns and his men had assumed they were being taken to some secret military facility, maybe a weapons plant or air base. But what they found was something simpler and more revealing. They arrived at Camp Concord, Ohio, a sprawling POW facility surrounded by barbed wire and pine trees. Inside the fences, there were wooden barracks, kitchens, even a library. The guards were polite but firm, and the food, though plain, was hot and plentiful. Bruns noticed it immediately. The abundance. The warehouses were full, the trucks constant. Nothing seemed to run short. Each morning, they were marched out under the rising sun to perform light labor, repairing fences, cutting timber, clearing roads. And every morning, without fail, the horizon would tremble with sound, the rumble of trains. It was always there, a distant thunder that never stopped. Sometimes, from a ridge near the camp, they could see it. The endless freight convoys rolling westward, steam rising in perfect columns against the sky. Long lines of boxcars, tankers, flatbeds carrying tanks, artillery pieces, even aircraft fuselages. To Bruns, it was mesmerizing. He would stand at the edge of the field, watching for minutes at a time as the convoys passed. One, then another, then another. Each train seemed longer than the last. Once, he counted for nearly an hour before the final car disappeared over the horizon. The guard beside him, a farmer from Iowa with a friendly grin, noticed. "Ain't much to look at, huh?" he said. "That one's heading to the coast. Tanks and rations, I think, for the boys in France." Bruns turned slowly, his English halting. "How many trains?" The man shrugged. "Hard to say. Hundreds a day, I reckon. Maybe more." Hundreds a day. Bruns stared after the fading line of freight cars, his hands tightening into fists. In the Reich, he remembered, supply trains were guarded like treasure. Fuel shipments were rare, ammunition scarcer still. Every movement had to be approved, every delay explained. And here they moved like clockwork, endless and efficient, as if the country itself were alive and determined. He couldn't stop thinking about it. Each night, as the prisoners returned to their barracks, he would sit near the window and listen. The faint hum of the American engine that never seemed to rest. Somewhere in the dark, another train was moving, another convoy departing, another factory roaring to life. The Germans had believed in superiority, in skill, precision, craftsmanship. But the Americans believed in something else. Quantity, motion, scale. They didn't build the best of anything. They built everything. And they built it faster than anyone could destroy it. One morning, during roll call, one of Bruns' men, a young radio man from Bremen, approached him quietly. "Herr Oberleutnant," he said, "I saw something yesterday, near the railway." "What was it?" "Trucks. Hundreds of them. They were parked in fields, like an army waiting for orders. But no one guarded them. No one even seemed to care. Bruns frowned. Trucks without guards? Yes, sir. Just rows and rows. Some brand new, some covered in tarps. And beyond them, I saw planes on flat cars, dozens of them, not wrecks, new. He paused. They have so much, they leave it outside. Bruns didn't respond. He didn't need to. He had seen it too. That night, in the dim light of the barracks, he spoke softly to the men gathered around him. "We thought we were fighting a nation," he said. "We were wrong. We were fighting a factory that covers a continent." They listened in silence. The only sound was the faint echo of another train passing somewhere far off in the night. He went on. "In Germany, a single tank means steel taken from ships, fuel taken from planes, men taken from farms. Here, it means nothing. They have more of everything than we could ever count." One of the sailors looked up. "Then we were doomed before it began?" Bruns nodded slowly. "Not doomed, just blind." He looked toward the window again, where a faint reflection of light flickered across the glass. Another convoy, another shipment, another heartbeat of an empire that never slept. In that moment, he realized what no speech from Goebbels, no order from Berlin could undo. Germany had not been beaten by strategy or courage. It had been beaten by a truth so vast that no one had dared to imagine it. The Americans had more ships, more trains, more steel, more time. And in war, time was everything. Autumn, 1944. The leaves had begun to fall around Camp Concord, scattering across the fences and guard towers. The air smelled faintly of coal smoke, a sign that the furnaces had been lit again in the factories beyond the horizon. By now, Bruns and his men were settled into routine. They worked, ate, and slept on schedule. The guards were courteous, sometimes even friendly. Newspapers filtered into the camp occasionally, passed from one prisoner to another until the pages were gray with fingerprints. The headlines told a story that felt both distant and impossible. Allied troops land in France. Paris liberated. American armies cross the Rhine. Each victory read like a death notice. Bruns no longer argued with the reports. He didn't shout at the guards or call the newspapers lies. He just folded the pages carefully and stared at them in silence. He had stopped thinking of the war as something that could still be won. What fascinated him now was how it was being won. Every few days, American supply trains thundered past the camp. Louder, longer, heavier. Sometimes he caught glimpses of their cargo. Lines of Sherman tanks chained to flat cars, artillery barrels covered in canvas, crates labeled sea rations, aviation fuel, ammunition handled with care. And sometimes the guards would talk. "They're sending new trucks to Patton," one said casually one morning. 4,000, I heard, right off the line in Detroit. 4,000 trucks for one general. Bruns smiled faintly to himself. When he had served aboard U-175, they had begged Berlin for spare diesel filters and gone 6 months without replacements. One night, after lights out, a fellow prisoner named Keller, a U-boat helmsman from Kiel, whispered across the barracks, "Do you think they ever run out?" "Of what?" Bruns asked. "Anything." Bruns didn't answer. The truth was clear now. They didn't. He had seen America's strength firsthand. In the convoys, in the railways, in the cranes and shipyards and endless streams of fuel trucks. And the most frightening part wasn't the scale. It was the ease. For every ship the Reich destroyed, 2 more took its place. For every plane shot down, 10 more were built. The prisoners had once believed that the Atlantic was their hunting ground, that they, the U-boat crews, held the power to strangle nations. But now, Bruns realized they had been fighting shadows. He thought of the shipyards he'd seen at Boston, of the lines of Liberty ships ready for launch. They were not symbols of war. They were processes, machines feeding machines. The Americans had made war into an assembly line, and Germany, for all its pride in discipline and precision, had no answer for that. One morning, the prisoners were taken on a work detail near a freight yard west of the camp. Under guard, they repaired fences while a massive train idled nearby. Bruns couldn't help but stare. The line of freight cars stretched beyond sight. Steam hissed from the locomotive's vents. The air smelled of oil, hot metal, and iron dust. He turned to a young American engineer standing on the platform. "Where is it going?" he asked. The man grinned. "Which one?" "This one's to New York, the next to New Orleans. After that, San Francisco, maybe. Hard to keep track." Bruns frowned. "How do you manage it? So many trains, so many routes?" The man shrugged, wiping grease from his hands. "We got rail control, telephones all along the lines, schedules down to the minute." He chuckled. "Guess you fellas didn't have that back home, huh?" Bruns managed a thin smile. "No," he said softly. "Not like this." Later that night, back in the camp, he spoke quietly to his men. "In Germany, we thought the Americans were soft," he said. "That they had machines but no spirit. We thought they wouldn't fight long, that they were spoiled by comfort." He paused. "We were wrong." The men listened in silence. Outside, a train whistle echoed faintly in the distance, followed by the deep, rhythmic rumble of wheels on steel. "They fight differently," Bruns continued. "Not with fury, with momentum. They never stop, not because they're fearless, but because they never have to stop to rebuild. While our factories burn, theirs multiply. While our soldiers march on foot, theirs ride in trucks built faster than we can dig trenches." He leaned back against the wall, his voice low. "We thought we were the wolves of the Atlantic, but we were only gnats against a storm." A long silence followed. Someone muttered a prayer. Another man cursed under his breath. Bruns stared out the window into the blackness, where faint lights glowed along the horizon. The freight yard still running through the night. He felt a strange calm wash over him, almost like relief. The war had been lost long before any of them had known it, not by generals or admirals, but by engineers, by workers, by the men and women who built faster than the Reich could destroy. He whispered to himself, almost reverently. They built their victory one crate at a time. Outside, another convoy thundered past, invisible in the dark, but impossible to ignore. Spring, 1945. Snow had melted from the fields around Camp Concord, and the air smelled of earth and gasoline. The war in Europe was collapsing, though few inside the wire yet knew how completely. Rumors passed among the prisoners like wind through tall grass, that Berlin was encircled, that Hitler was dead, that the Reich was already ash. But even before the radio confirmed it, Bruns and the others could feel it in the air. The trains were still moving. The factories were still roaring. The Americans had not slowed, not even now, when victory was inevitable. That was what frightened him most. On a warm April morning, the guards allowed a group of prisoners to work outside the camp's perimeter under supervision. They were sent to clear a disused rail siding. Bruns volunteered. As he worked, he found himself standing beside an American switchman in denim overalls. His sleeves rolled to the elbow, face smudged with soot. The man worked methodically, checking the couplings, oiling the gears, scribbling notes in a logbook. Bruns studied him for a moment. The man moved with a kind of quiet confidence. Not pride, not arrogance, but assurance born from routine. "You never stop," Bruns said finally, his English halting but clear. The American looked up. "Nope," he said simply. "Can't afford to." Bruns gestured toward the endless line of freight cars waiting to depart. "Even now? The war is ending." The man grinned faintly. "War ends. Work doesn't." He said it like a truth older than both of them. Bruns looked down at his hands. rough, scarred, still carrying traces of grease from the U-boat engine room. He wondered what a man like this would have done in his place. He wondered what his own country might have become if it had learned to build instead of destroy. That afternoon, a rumor swept through the camp like wildfire. The Americans have crossed the Elbe. Berlin is falling. The prisoners gathered near the barracks, straining to hear the guards' radios. There was no celebration, no anger, only silence. After a while, Bruns walked to the fence and rested his hands on the cold wire. Beyond it, the fields were green again, dotted with dandelions. He watched a freight train thunder past in the distance, its engine gleaming in the sunlight. He turned to one of the younger prisoners, a machinist named Weber, and said quietly, "That's how they win. Not with generals, but with gears." Weber frowned. "What do you mean?" Bruns nodded toward the train. "Look at it. Every wheel turns with the others. Every man, every machine, every hour. They don't fight for glory. They fight for motion." He paused, his eyes following the endless stream of cars fading into the horizon. "We fought for symbols. They fought for schedules." Weber was silent. That night, as the camp lights dimmed, Bruns lay awake listening to the sound of rain on the roof. It mingled with the distant hum of trains, a sound he had come to think of as the pulse of America itself. In the darkness, he remembered something an officer had said back in Lorient years earlier. The Americans build like children play, without end, without sense. How wrong that had been. They didn't build without sense. They built with purpose. They built because motion was their language and industry their creed. And now, that creed had reshaped the world. 2 weeks later, the guards gathered the prisoners in the yard. The camp commander, a tall Navy officer with gray at his temples, stepped forward. "Gentlemen," he said simply, "Germany has surrendered." The words hung in the air like smoke. No one cheered. Some lowered their heads. Others stood motionless, eyes fixed on nothing. Bruns felt a strange stillness settle over him. Not shock, not sorrow, just clarity. It was as if the noise of the war had finally stopped, and all that was left was truth. That evening, he sat alone outside the barracks, watching the last light fade from the sky. He thought of his home in Hamburg, the harbor where he had once watched ships depart for distant waters. He wondered if it still stood. He wondered if his family had survived. He thought of the Atlantic, the vast gray expanse that had once felt infinite, and realized it had only ever been a bridge that America had crossed with steel and oil and willpower. The war had not just ended in defeat, it had ended in revelation. Bruns finally understood what he had seen that day in Boston Harbor. The cranes, the ships, the convoys. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't showmanship. It was belief. Belief that nothing was too big to build and nothing too broken to fix. He whispered into the cooling air, "They never fought the way we did. They built until we couldn't fight anymore." A guard passing nearby heard him and stopped. "What was that, Captain?" Bruns looked up, his voice calm. "I was just thinking," he said. "You didn't win because we lost." The guard raised an eyebrow. "No?" Bruns shook his head slowly. "You won because you never stopped." The guard gave a small nod, then walked on. The sound of another train echoed through the night. It wasn't carrying soldiers or weapons anymore, just grain, coal, and steel. The same engines that had built a war were now building a world. Bruns watched until the last faint whistle faded into silence. Then he closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, he felt something like peace. The war had ended, but the movement, the hum, the rhythm, would never stop, because that was America's secret. It didn't conquer, it continued.